What would possess a father to lock away his own child, to shield her from the world she was born into? What twisted vision could lead him to isolate her from every joy, every experience, every breath of fresh air the outside world could offer? What kind of experiment would justify a child's confinement to darkness and silence, never to witness the warmth of the sun or hear the laughter of another soul? It was no ordinary father who made such a choice, no ordinary man who looked at a life he had created and saw only potential for control, for manipulation, for science. There are many ways to measure a human being's worth, but what if, for one man, the measurement was not love, not nurturing, but something far colder, far more calculated? What if this man, in his desperation to push the limits of what was possible, chose his daughter as nothing more than a vessel, a subject of his bizarre obsession, a life that existed solely for his twisted ambitions? Imagine, for a moment, being born into a world that was not a world at all. A world without laughter, without voices, without any human contact except the one person who had decided your fate before you even took your first breath. Imagine never knowing what it was to play, to run in a field, to fall asleep under the stars or wake to the sounds of birdsong. For one child, this was her reality, her birthright, not as a blessing, but as a tool. A tool to be shaped, studied, and tested. What kind of man could make such a choice for his own child? What kind of belief could drive him to lock her away, to keep her from every essential part of being human? He saw potential, yes. But it wasn't the kind of potential any child should be subjected to. The potential to become something greater, something different, something more, at any cost. It wasn't about love. It was about control. It was about pushing the boundaries of what humanity could endure, what it could become, even if it meant sacrificing the very essence of humanity itself. For years, she existed in that room. There was no clock to measure the days, no calendar to mark her passage from one year to the next. Time became irrelevant, a blur, a constant companion that she could never escape, never control. Her world was confined to four walls, four cold corners that became her universe. There was no kindness, no comfort, no one to tell her that the world outside was a place of joy and wonder. But there were whispers in that silence. Whispers she couldn't quite understand. The air, thick with secrets, grew heavier with each passing day. She felt the weight of them even when she couldn't fully grasp their meaning. She was a test subject, a living experiment, the consequences of which she couldn't yet fathom. The question was never whether she was human. No, the question was always whether she could be something more than human. A better version. A perfected version. The man, her father, saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. His ambition burned with the intensity of a man who believed he could unlock the very secrets of creation itself, no matter the cost. But in his pursuit of greatness, he abandoned the most basic principles of humanity. He discarded the love a parent should feel for their child, the bond that should protect them, that should guide them toward freedom, not force them into captivity. Her world, confined to that room, became her prison. A prison built by the very hands that brought her into existence. She had no choice but to accept it. What else could she do? What else was there to do but surrender to the will of the man who controlled everything she knew, everything she saw, everything she felt? But something stirred within her. Something deep, something that would not be stifled by the dark corners of her world, by the cruel silence her father had forced upon her. She began to question. She began to wonder. What if there was more? What if there was something outside those walls that she had been denied? The longing for freedom, for truth, began to grow within her heart, a seed planted in the dark, ready to break free. And as that seed grew, so too did the realization that her father's control could not last forever. In the stillness of her confined existence, in the quiet that threatened to swallow her, she began to imagine a world that was not made up of cold walls and sterile equipment. A world where she could breathe freely, where her thoughts could wander without fear of punishment, where the sun would warm her skin and the stars would be her companions. She could hear the echoes of those possibilities in the back of her mind, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing day. What would she do when the time came to face her father? What would she say? How could she even begin to understand what he had done to her, to them both? How could she reconcile the love she still felt for the man who had made her, with the hatred that began to rise in her heart for the torment he had subjected her to? The longer she stayed in that room, the more she realized that her father's experiment, the one he had crafted with such care, had one fatal flaw: it had underestimated the power of a human spirit, the will to survive, to break free, no matter the cost. And so, as she sat in that room, alone with her thoughts, the weight of her father's twisted ambitions upon her, a new question began to take shape. What would she do when the door finally opened? Would she run, or would she stand and face him, the man who had brought her into a life of darkness, the man who had shaped her existence with his own hands? The time was coming, and when it did, everything would change. The question was no longer whether she would break free, but what would she do when she finally had the chance? The father, a man of meticulous mind and cold calculation, had never truly fit into the world. Where others saw a man of science, he saw himself as a visionary, a misunderstood genius, willing to sacrifice everything for the pursuit of knowledge. His name, once whispered with reverence in scientific circles, had become a distant echo, drowned out by the weight of his growing obsession. In his younger years, he had been an idealist, a researcher with a burning desire to understand the very fabric of human existence. His studies in genetics had begun with noble intentions, an attempt to unravel the mysteries of heredity, to improve the human race. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. His methods grew more radical, his theories more outlandish. He began to question not just what could be done with genetic material, but what should be done. His thoughts moved beyond ethical boundaries, edging into territory where few dared to tread. The question he asked wasn't simply, can this be done, but what happens if we push the limits of human nature itself? He immersed himself in the works of those who had flirted with the edge of science. Men and women who had been dismissed as mad for their groundbreaking, if dangerous, ideas. He believed he had found the key to unlocking human potential, and in this key, he saw his own greatness reflected. He was no longer bound by the limitations of morality. He was above it. The rest of the world might scoff at his ambitions, but he was certain that his discoveries would be the key to saving humanity. Or so he convinced himself. His obsession with genetics and human biology took him down a path of isolation. He abandoned the scientific community, disregarded their warnings, and turned inward, determined to prove his theories at any cost. The more he worked, the more consumed he became by the idea of creating something new, something perfect. He was no longer content with mere observation. He wanted control. He wanted to create life in his image. And for that, he needed a subject. An untainted canvas upon which he could apply his radical theories. That subject came to him in a way that few could have predicted. The child. She was not born in the conventional sense. Her conception was the result of methods considered unethical by the scientific community, genetic engineering, in vitro fertilization, possibly even the manipulation of unknown genetic material. There were whispers that he had used genetic material from multiple sources, blending DNA from different creatures in an effort to create a superior being, one who would carry within her the future of humanity. He believed that, through a controlled environment, free from the chaotic influences of society and human emotion, this child could be shaped into something more than human, a being whose mind and body were perfect, designed to achieve things that normal people could never dream of. But why did he choose this path? What made him believe that a child, a living being, could be a part of his experiment? Was it his desire to transcend the limitations of nature? Was it his thirst for recognition, for greatness, that pushed him to justify the horrific reality of his actions? Or was it something deeper, something darker within him, a need to control, to dominate, to impose his will on life itself? He saw the child not as a daughter, not as a human being, but as the key to unlocking a new era of human evolution. He believed that in her, he could break the chains of biology and pave the way for a new kind of humanity. She was an experiment, a living testament to his theories, the proof of his genius. He justified his actions with grand ideas about advancing mankind, about pushing the boundaries of life itself, even if it meant bending the very essence of morality and nature. His belief was absolute. He saw no flaw in his vision, no fault in his logic. The world, in his mind, was full of limitations he was determined to break. And in breaking those limitations, he was not just changing the world. He was becoming something more. He was a creator, not just of life, but of a new kind of human being. He had become the master of nature, the architect of a future that no one else could see. But in his pursuit of this vision, he could not have foreseen the consequences of his choices. He did not account for the humanity of the child. He did not realize that his experiment, no matter how scientifically sound it seemed, would not yield the results he imagined. The question arises, what led him to believe that a child, his own flesh and blood, could be subjected to such a dark and twisted experiment? Was it his belief in his own intellectual superiority? Was it the overwhelming need to prove that he could control life itself? Or had something else, something far deeper and more unsettling, been driving him all along? As he watched the child grow, isolated from the world, the weight of his experiment settled heavily on his shoulders. He had created her for a purpose, but in doing so, he had shaped not just her future, but his own fate. His experiment was not just about science. It was about power, about control, about bending nature to his will, and ultimately, about seeing just how far he could push the boundaries of what it meant to be human. The truth, however, was far more complex than he could ever have imagined. The father, once a man of reason and calculation, now found himself trapped in the very web he had woven. The child, his test subject, had become something far beyond his control. The child's world was confined to four walls. Cold, unyielding, and silent, the room was her entire reality. From the moment she opened her eyes, the outside world was nothing more than a distant concept, a place she would never reach, never touch. Every day, the walls of her existence grew higher, thicker, more suffocating. There was no escape, no relief from the monotony that defined her life. The room was sterile, clinical, as if it were designed not just to isolate her physically, but to strip her of any sense of self, any understanding of the life she had been denied. Her days were filled with routine, an endless cycle of observation and manipulation. Each movement, each gesture, was studied, measured, and analyzed. Her father, the man who should have been her protector, her guide, was instead her jailer. He was always there, watching from a distance, observing her every action with cold detachment. His presence, once a comfort, became a reminder of her imprisonment. He would occasionally approach her, speaking to her in the same calm, emotionless voice, asking questions that seemed more like commands. There was no love in his tone, no warmth in his gaze. There was only the unrelenting drive to push his experiment forward, to bend the child to his will. Respond, test subject. Speak, move, act. I need to see if you are capable, he would say, his words hollow, like a scientist addressing a specimen. She learned to respond, not because she wanted to, but because she knew it was expected of her. The father's methods were precise, mechanical. There were tests, endless tests, tests of her physical endurance, her cognitive abilities, her emotional responses. Her body became a subject of study, her mind a puzzle to be solved. He subjected her to controlled environments where the simplest task could become a challenge. How long could she sit still without moving? Could she solve a problem under pressure? Could she endure discomfort without reacting? Her father, in his infinite wisdom, believed that these tests were necessary, that they would reveal the true nature of her capabilities, that they would make her stronger, better. But in the silence of her isolation, the child began to feel something more than the cold, mechanical touch of his tests. There was a growing sense of unease, a rising awareness that the tests were not just about improvement, they were about control. Her father's motivations, once clear and logical in her mind, began to blur. She could see it in the way his eyes gleamed when he spoke about her progress, in the way he manipulated every aspect of her life to suit his goals. Was she truly his creation, his perfect experiment, or was she merely a tool to satisfy his obsession? The experiments began to grow darker, more invasive. Flashbacks reveal moments from her past, where the tests crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed. She would wake to find herself strapped to a table, her body restrained, her senses overwhelmed with sensory input. The father's voice echoed in her ears, telling her to focus, to resist the discomfort, to prove her strength. He measured her reactions, recorded her heart rate, analyzed her breathing patterns. Each experiment became a battle of endurance, pushing her body and mind to the brink. One test, in particular, haunted her memories. The father had placed her in a chamber designed to test her response to isolation, trapping her in a small, enclosed space for hours, forcing her to confront the silence and the darkness, alone with her thoughts. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the walls closing in around her, as if the room itself was suffocating her. She cried out for him, desperate for his presence, for any kind of reassurance. But he was not there. His voice came only through a speaker, cold and distant. "Do not call for help," he said. "You must learn to endure." With every test, every moment of discomfort, the lines between the child and the experiment began to blur. Who was she, really? Was she just an extension of her father's will, his creation to be perfected? Or was there something inside of her, a spark of life, that could not be extinguished, no matter how hard he tried? As the years passed, the child began to grow more aware of her surroundings. She started to notice the subtle changes in her father's behavior. There was a certain intensity to his gaze, a fire in his eyes when he looked at her, as if she were no longer just his test subject, but something more. A creature to be molded, to be perfected. His experiments became more invasive, his control over her more absolute. He began to force her to participate in psychological tests, pushing her to confront her own thoughts, her own emotions. He would place her in situations where she had to choose, choosing between pain and pleasure, between fear and submission. Each decision was a test, a measurement of her willpower, her strength. But what he didn't understand, what he failed to see, was that the child was beginning to change. The more he tried to break her, the stronger she became. It was as if each test, each experiment, was slowly awakening something inside her, something primal. And yet, despite the growing sense of rebellion within her, there were moments of doubt. She still felt the pull of his authority, the weight of his control over her life. He was her creator, her father, the one who had shaped her existence from the very beginning. How could she defy him? How could she break free from the man who had made her, the man who had turned her into this thing, this experiment? As the tension built within her, the experiments grew more frequent, more extreme. Each day felt like a battle, a struggle between the desire to break free and the need to please her father, to prove that she was worthy of his attention, of his love. The child's growing awareness of her situation, of the experiment that was her life, created an internal conflict that would soon reach its breaking point. Was it truly about perfection, or was it something more dangerous? Was her father trying to create the ideal human being, or was he simply trying to break her spirit, to control her, to see how far he could push her before she snapped? The audience begins to feel the child's growing sense of entrapment, a tension that lingers with every test, every interaction. As her father's motivations grow murkier, the question lingers in the air: is he trying to perfect her, or is he simply trying to prove that he can control her, bend her to his will, no matter the cost? The child's life, once confined entirely to the room and the sterile tests her father imposed on her, began to shift with subtlety, almost imperceptibly. Her awareness of the outside world, the world beyond the walls of her prison, grew slowly, triggered by the smallest of experiences, moments that should have been insignificant, but became sparks of revelation. It began with sound. In the dead of night, when her father was deep in his research or otherwise occupied, she began to hear it. Faint at first, distant, but growing louder over time, voices, laughter, the sound of something real, something alive. The outside world was not silent, as her father had made it seem. People existed out there. Real people. She started to listen, to press her ear against the cold wall of her room in the hopes of catching a fragment of what lay beyond. The distant murmur of life, a life she could only imagine. She could hear the sounds of birds in the morning, the rustling of leaves outside, and even music drifting through the walls. Each sound was a thread she followed, a piece of the puzzle she'd been denied for so long. The knowledge of the outside world seeped into her like a steady, unrelenting tide, slowly eroding the walls of her confinement. In time, the child discovered more. While her father was away, his constant surveillance slackened, and she began to find small, hidden clues, books, old magazines, pages from newspapers, left carelessly on shelves or under furniture. These fragments of the world outside were more than just forbidden knowledge. They were a window, a way to see the world she had been kept from. She devoured them in secret, learning to read, teaching herself, as if each word was a key unlocking a door she had never thought possible to open. Her mind, previously confined to the narrow space her father had allowed, began to expand. She learned of places, cities, oceans, countries, things that once felt like fantasies, distant and unreachable, now became vivid images in her mind. She read about love, about loss, about people coming together and falling apart. These words, so foreign at first, became her comfort, her escape from the endless cycle of tests and isolation. One day, she saw something that would change everything. The door to her room, which had been locked for so long, was left ajar. Her father was absent, focused on his work in another part of the house. For the first time, the opportunity to step into the world outside the room presented itself. Her heart raced, her pulse quickened. She took one tentative step forward, then another, until she was standing at the threshold of her prison, gazing out into the dark, empty hallway. Her world, so small and restricted, suddenly felt vast, like an ocean she had been too afraid to cross. But she hesitated. A rush of fear gripped her. The room, her small sanctuary, had become her safe place, even if it was a prison. The thought of leaving it, venturing into the unknown, was terrifying. She had never been told what lay beyond the door. Had her father intentionally kept her from this world to protect her, or was it simply to control her? She stepped back, returning to her confined space, the door quietly clicking shut behind her. But something had shifted. The desire to escape, to know more, to break free from the experiment her father had created, now burned in her chest. She couldn't unsee what she had glimpsed. As days passed, the child's curiosity grew. She began to experiment on her own. She would sneak glances through windows, even though they were high up, unreachable, barely offering any view. She listened harder when people passed outside the house, their conversations muffled but clear enough to spark the fire of her growing longing. She was learning more about the world every day, even if she couldn't yet fully comprehend what it meant. Her father, for his part, remained oblivious to the growing unrest in his experiment. His obsessive need for control had blinded him to the child's emotional and intellectual development. He saw her as a subject, nothing more. But as she learned more about the world outside, she began to question everything. Why had he kept her in isolation for so long? What had he really been trying to achieve with his tests? The truth, she soon realized, was far more sinister than she had imagined. Through the books she found and the fragments of knowledge she pieced together, the child began to understand that her father wasn't just trying to test her limits or create a superior human being. He was trying to prove something, to himself and to the world. His experiments, his tests, were not about improvement. They were about control. He believed that society, the world outside, was flawed, corrupt, and that the only way to rise above it was through isolation. He had long subscribed to twisted ideas of social Darwinism, a belief that only the fittest should survive, and that the rest of humanity was destined for failure. He had chosen her to be his experiment because she was a blank slate, a vessel he could mold into his ideal. He believed that by isolating her, by stripping away the corrupting influences of the outside world, he could create someone, something, better, purer, more perfect. He wasn't just shaping a human being. He was trying to create a new species, free from the flaws he saw in the world. But what he failed to see was that in his attempt to create perfection, he had overlooked the most essential thing: humanity. The child, locked away and tested relentlessly, was still human. Her capacity for growth, for rebellion, for freedom, could not be erased by his experiments. His attempt to craft a perfect being was not just flawed, it was doomed to fail. The child had spent years under his control, unaware of the full scope of his plans. But now, with her new knowledge and understanding, she saw it for what it was: madness. His true obsession was not the pursuit of knowledge, but the desire to play God, to manipulate life and death according to his twisted views of science and society. In a pivotal moment, she confronted him. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of unspoken tension. Her father, ever the cold, calculating scientist, looked at her with a mixture of surprise and disdain. He had never once expected her to challenge him. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. "Why did you keep me hidden from the world? Why didn't you let me live like other people?" Her father's eyes hardened, his gaze cold. He stood up, walking toward her slowly, as if the answer was self-evident. "You are not like other people," he said, his voice cold, calculated. "You were never meant to be. I created you to be more. To be something better. I isolated you to protect you from the world, from its corruption." Her heart sank. "But at what cost?" she whispered. The confrontation, charged with years of anger, confusion, and realization, marked a turning point. The father's cold, rational justification crumbled in the face of her simple, human question. The tension that had been building between them erupted, and for the first time, the child saw her father not as a creator, but as a man, flawed, broken, and consumed by his own delusions. And in that moment, everything changed. The air in the house had shifted. The walls that had once felt like a safe, familiar confinement now felt suffocating. The child, no longer the quiet, compliant test subject her father had molded her to be, had begun to see the cracks in the foundation of her world. The escape, both physical and psychological, was no longer just a distant thought, it was a need, a desperate urge that clawed at her insides with every passing day. She had learned to wait for the right moment, to watch for the weaknesses in her father's routine. She had spent years studying his habits, observing the rhythms of the house. She knew when he was immersed in his work, when he would retreat into his study and lose himself in his research. These were her moments of opportunity, the fleeting seconds when she could make a move. One night, she saw it, a chance to break free. Her father was locked in his study, as usual, and the house was eerily quiet. She had been planning this for days, gathering every bit of courage, every shred of knowledge she had learned over the years. The books, the whispers from the outside world, the silent observations she'd made, everything was leading up to this moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the door of her room. She had never touched the door's lock, never attempted to leave before. The sheer weight of it, the finality of the moment, made her hands shake. But she had learned, she had studied how to pick the lock, how to bypass the simple mechanism that had kept her in place for so long. With each turn of the key, with each quiet click of the lock, she felt a burst of freedom in her chest. The door creaked open, and she stepped out, her foot barely making a sound as it hit the floor. Her body moved of its own accord, instinctively, guided by the survival skills she had developed over years of isolation. Each step she took felt like a defiance, an act of rebellion against the man who had shaped her world into a cage. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent, but she didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, quietly, like a shadow slipping through the cracks. The further she moved from her room, the more she felt the weight of her father's control lift from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, she was free to choose where she went, what she did, who she could be. But just as she reached the staircase, a sound, faint but unmistakable, froze her in place. Her father's voice, distant yet sharp, calling her name. The power struggle had begun. She had only seconds to make a decision. She knew that if he caught her now, there would be no escape. He had always maintained control, always kept her within reach. If she returned to him now, if she allowed him to recapture her, everything she had fought for would be lost. But could she really go on? Could she survive outside his grasp? Her mind raced. She could hear her father's footsteps, his voice growing closer. The moment was slipping away, and she knew that every choice she made from here on out would determine her future, her very survival. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the back door. The door that led outside, into the unknown. She had never seen the world beyond the house, never felt the earth beneath her feet, but she knew that this was the only chance she had. Her fingers grasped the cold handle, and she turned. It opened. For a moment, she stood there, breathing in the air, feeling the weight of the night sky above her, and the ground beneath her feet. She had done it. She was free. Or so she thought. Just as she stepped out into the night, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, rushed, frantic. Her heart dropped. Her father was closing in, faster than she expected. In the distance, she could hear the sound of his voice, his words almost lost in the wind. "You can't escape me." But there was no turning back now. She ran. The grass beneath her feet was wet, the chill of the night air biting at her skin, but the taste of freedom was intoxicating. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the ache in her muscles, the sting of the cold, the sound of her father's voice growing louder. And then, an obstacle. A figure emerged from the darkness ahead, blocking her path. A man. She froze, panic surging through her. The figure stepped forward, and she realized, it was her father's assistant, the one who had helped him conduct his experiments. He wasn't just an observer. He had been complicit in the tests. He was part of the system that had kept her prisoner. He raised a hand, a gesture meant to stop her, to force her back into the world she had known. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out. She could fight him, she thought, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet authority, a sense of power that she couldn't ignore. "Please," she gasped, "let me go. You don't understand." But the man only stepped closer. "Your father will never allow it. You belong to him." The word struck her like a physical blow. You belong to him. That was the truth she had been running from all her life. But in that moment, standing at the precipice of freedom, she realized that no one, could own her anymore. With a surge of adrenaline, she ducked under his outstretched arm and bolted forward, pushing past him, using every ounce of strength she had left. The sound of his footsteps was drowned out by the pounding of her heart as she reached the edge of the property. The gates, unlocked. A barrier between her and the world. With one final, desperate push, she squeezed through the narrow gap, and for the first time in her life, she was truly free. But as she collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, the realization hit her, she had broken out, yes, but at what cost? The emotional toll was visible, her body was trembling, her mind racing, and the weight of everything she had left behind pressed heavily on her chest. The question now was not whether she had escaped, but whether she could survive the world that awaited her. And then, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of her father's voice, close now, a threat that would never fade. "You can run, but you cannot hide." The cliffhanger loomed. Had she truly escaped? Would her father find her again? Or was her quest for freedom only just beginning? The darkness outside was vast, but so was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The child's escape had marked the end of one chapter, but it was only the beginning of another, far more complicated story. As she wandered through the unfamiliar world, the weight of her father's actions pressed down on her like 1,000 invisible hands. She had run from him, from the walls that had contained her for so long, but what she had carried with her, what she would carry for the rest of her life, was far heavier than any physical restraint. The world outside was vast, overwhelming, and endlessly fascinating, but it was also terrifying. There were faces she didn't recognize, customs she didn't understand, and sounds that seemed foreign and alien to her. People walked past her in the streets, their lives moving forward as if nothing had changed, as if the world she had been born into was just another place in the great machinery of life. But she couldn't blend in. She couldn't simply step into their world as though it had always been hers. She had been locked away for years, her development stunted by isolation, her understanding of human interaction warped by years of manipulation. She had been taught to obey, to follow orders, to be perfect. But in the real world, there were no instructions. There were no rigid tests, no controlled experiments to guide her. The most basic social cues eluded her: how to speak to strangers, how to make friends, how to be part of the rhythm of life that others took for granted. Each interaction felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve, a test she was always failing. In the days and weeks that followed her escape, the emotional toll of her upbringing began to surface in ways she couldn't ignore. The isolation that had once been a constant presence, a silent companion, now haunted her thoughts. She would find herself staring out into the crowd, feeling like an outsider, disconnected from the lives around her. The trauma of her childhood. The lack of warmth, the endless experiments, had left deep scars. She would flinch at loud noises, her heart racing, her body tensing at every unexpected sound. Her mind, once sharp and quick, now seemed clouded by confusion. How could she possibly trust anyone when the only person she had ever known had manipulated her, controlled her every move? But there was something else. A growing rage, a burning need for justice. She had been a victim of her father's delusions, a pawn in his twisted game of experimentation. He had seen her as a tool, not a child, and yet she had survived. She had escaped. And now, she was determined to find a way to make him see the damage he had done, not just to her, but to himself. Her father, once a man driven by cold logic and his own obsession with control, had been shattered by her escape. The world he had carefully constructed for years had crumbled. His experiments, his theories, his plans for perfection, all of it had been exposed as a farce. The child he had shaped in his image, the perfect specimen, had broken free. But what of him? What had become of the man who had locked her away for so long? The consequences of his actions were far-reaching, but they were not as immediate as she had hoped. She had expected him to crumble under the weight of his failure, to be consumed by guilt, regret, or at the very least, by the recognition of the damage he had caused. But no, he didn't feel that way. Not in the way she had imagined. Instead, he retreated further into his work, his obsession growing. Even with his experiment unraveling, he couldn't let go. He couldn't see what he had done wrong. To him, the failure was hers. She was the one who had broken the experiment, the one who had refused to comply, to be perfected. In his mind, she was still just another subject, another disappointment in his long list of failures. He became even more isolated, disappearing from the public eye. The whispers around his name faded, and he was reduced to a shadow of his former self, a man who had lost everything to his own obsessions. His scientific colleagues, once intrigued by his theories, now distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with the man whose name had become synonymous with madness. And so, he remained, buried in his work, fixated on the idea of creating the perfect human being. The man who had sought to control life, to shape it according to his will, now found himself powerless. The child had escaped, and the experiment had ended in failure. Yet, he could not see the truth. He had created a monster. An individual who could not be manipulated, who could not be controlled. And in that, he had failed. But what of the child? The girl who had run, who had escaped his grasp. What was her future now that she was free? She was not free in the way she had imagined. The world outside, so full of potential, had become a labyrinth, a place where she was forced to navigate the wreckage of her past. The trauma of her isolation, the manipulations of her father, echoed in her every move. She would never be like the others, the ones who had grown up free, the ones who had been allowed to experience love, warmth, affection. Her life, her very sense of self, had been twisted by her father's obsession, and no matter how far she ran, no matter how much distance she put between herself and the past, she couldn't outrun the scars it had left. The child, now grown, was not the perfect creation her father had envisioned. She was something far more complex. Someone who had fought to survive, who had fought to break free. But in the process, she had lost a part of herself. She was caught between the person her father had tried to make her and the person she wanted to become. And so, she walked forward, alone in a world that had once been a dream, now a harsh reality. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, it was hers to shape. Would she find peace? Would she learn to heal the wounds her father had inflicted? Or would the past continue to haunt her, pulling her back into a world she had spent so long escaping? Only time would tell. But one thing was clear, her father's experiment had not broken her. It had only made her stronger. And as she stepped into the unknown, one thing was certain, the world was hers to claim. But it would not be an easy road. As the child now walks through the world, a survivor of something that should never have been, we are left with the haunting realization that her story is not unique. Her escape, while a victory, is a dark reminder of the countless other children who may have suffered, or still suffer, under the hands of those who believe that the ends justify the means. How many others, hidden from view, have been subjected to experiments in the name of science, in the name of progress? How many innocent lives have been manipulated, controlled, shaped into something their creators saw as perfect, but at the cost of their humanity? This isn't just a story of one girl or one father. It is a reflection of the dangers that lie in the unchecked pursuit of knowledge, in the obsession with control, and in the blind belief that we can play God. What happens when those who are supposed to protect us instead become the architects of our suffering? What happens when we lose sight of the boundaries between science and morality? The question we are left with is a difficult one: how far are we willing to go in the name of progress? When does the pursuit of knowledge cross the line into exploitation? The father believed that in perfecting the child, in making her an experiment, he was advancing humanity. But in doing so, he lost sight of the most important truth of all. The very essence of what it means to be human cannot be measured by control, manipulation, or isolation. Humanity is found in freedom, in choice, in love, and in connection. The child's fate, while tragic, is also a call to us all to consider the cost of blind ambition. How much are we willing to sacrifice to reach the future we envision? And at what point do we ask ourselves, what price are we willing to pay for progress? As we reflect on this story, we are reminded that some experiments should never be conducted. Some lives, some children, should never be locked away, sacrificed for the sake of an experiment, no matter how grand the vision. The ethical boundaries we establish today will determine the kind of future we leave behind for generations to come. Before you go, take a moment to think about the questions this story raises. What do we stand to lose in the name of progress? And how can we ensure that humanity, in its pursuit of knowledge, never forgets the value of compassion, dignity, and freedom? If this story has made you think, then please, like, comment, and share. Your voice matters. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, provoke, and inspire. Together, we can ensure that these dark histories never repeat themselves. And always remember, some experiments shouldn't be conducted. Some children should never be locked away. The question remains, how far will we go in the name of progress?